The president's arrival in Chicago, we are getting new information on a heartbreaking story, putting another human face on reports of out-of-control violence in that city. This is 25-year-old Indiana National Guardsman Willie Cook. He had been home from Afghanistan for 5 months before he was gunned down in what appears to be a case of mistaken identity. His body was found slumped over his 2-year-old son, who he was attempting to shield. Here's Cook's wounded son in the arms of his widow. The little boy was also hit in the left and right legs, and a third bullet grazed the toddler's head. Cook's widow says her husband's last act was to protect their baby.
And he saved his son. He made sure that before he left, the last thing he did was make sure his son was okay. And to know that your 2-year-old has to pretend to talk to his dad. Come home not even 5 months later, and for your life to just be taken away like that, it's not fair.
What a mess. He survives Afghanistan, only to get gunned down in Chicago. Joining us now, Michelle Malkin, a conservative columnist and a Fox News contributor who has looked into Chicago's epidemic of violence and knows a lot about this subject. Michelle, what a nightmare. And I mean, that's just the latest face on an epidemic of crime and violence in that city that they've tried in some ways to tackle, totally unsuccessfully, according to the stats.
It really is, and it is tragic, and you could run one of those stories every single day. I think it points to something very cynical in a lot of the news coverage of gun violence, particularly over the last several months. For the Democrats, it's always been an advantage to emphasize those tragedies where they can demonize the Second Amendment, demonize the national NRA, and look to bigger government solutions as the answer. But Chicago, the Windy City, Obama's hometown, is ground zero for the massive failure of gun control policies. And that is why, over the last several decades, you haven't seen the massive death toll stories out of inner city Chicago highlighted on the front pages of newspapers.
They literally, we talked about this with Chris Starwell, have the strictest gun laws in the country. And yet 506 gun-related, 506 murders last year and 2,200 shooting incidents last year alone. Actually, 2,460 shooting incidents last year. Now, President Obama is going to go there and he will use those same stats to say the gun laws need to change. But the gun laws there are already about as strict as they can be and still be consistent with the Constitution, Michelle.
That's right, and you know that it wasn't until a couple of years ago when the Supreme Court struck down the handgun ban that individuals, law-abiding individuals, couldn't even own those. You can't get a concealed carry license in Illinois. I believe it's the only state in the country where that is true. And so there's this warped sort of intellectual yoga that they have to engage in to try and argue for greater gun control. And then, of course, what I think it really raises, and this was the point of the column that I wrote this week, is the failure of these social policies that replace the family with the government. And I mean, we've had, Democratic rule for nearly a century in Chicago. And whether you're talking about the streets, public housing, or the failed Chicago public school system, nothing they do to pour more money into the problem or more government regulations is working.
Well, I know you believe that it's politically risky for the president to go to Chicago, of all places, and make this speech because he hails from Chicago. His top lieutenants hail from Chicago, Valerie Jarrett among them. And I know you've done the research and have a lot of criticism about what they have done or failed to do to get that city cleaned up. We're going to pick it up on that point right after the break. Michelle, you read in your column, MichelleMalkin.com, about how Valerie Jarrett, President Obama's top advisor, and President Obama spent a lot of years in Chicago and tried to conduct this social justice experiment to clean up the city with very, well, mixed results, to put it gently.
Yeah, they announced it, unveiled it, called it the Plan for Transformation, and it was $500 million in state and federal money to try and rescue all of these bloody hellholes, the public housing developments. They're infamous, and everyone's heard of Cabrini Green, but places like Altgeld Gardens and Grove Park, which was the slum that Valerie Jarrett's real estate empire, Habitat Inc., was in charge of. She was in charge of several of them, and over the years, what has happened after they've dumped all of this money into them? Well, they remain racially segregated ghettos, as violent as ever, these war zones. And Obama's going to waltz in and promise more money, more government help in the form of so-called promise zones, when what you have is just such an abject record of failure. And in the end, I think what's happened with many of these things is they've ended up as crony deals that have benefited all of the developers that helped Obama into power and continue to line its pockets, but have done so little for the families and especially the children that are still relegated to these ghettos.
And I know you say in your piece that, you know, there's none of this money is a substitute for fatherlessness, illegitimacy, and family disintegration for solving and addressing, even acknowledging those problems. Michelle, always great hearing your perspective. Thanks for being here.
You bet, and congrats.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
You bet.
If you missed the show yesterday, I announced that my husband and I are expecting a third baby this summer.